Christmas watchman. That evening started like any other. Our school was preparing for a big Christmas party, and teachers and students were leaving after a long day of rehearsals. The hallways were growing empty, and only a few senior students, including me, stayed behind to help decorate the assembly hall. I've always loved the holiday atmosphere in school. Artificial Christmas trees, garlands, shimmering tinsel, it all felt warm and festive. But that evening, something felt off. The air seemed heavy, and the shadows from the frost-covered windows fell on the floor at unnaturally sharp angles. By 10 o'clock, almost everyone had left. Only me, my friend Lisa, and our teacher Miss Graham remained. We were hanging the last decorations when we heard a sound that made us freeze. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate steps echoing through the empty hallways. "Who's there?" Lisa asked, looking nervously at Miss Graham. "I don't know," the teacher replied with a frown. "There shouldn't be anyone else here." We assumed it was the janitor, Mr. Edwards. He was old and grumpy, but he took his job seriously. Miss Graham suggested we check to make sure everything was okay, and Lisa and I decided to go with her. On the second floor, in the longest and darkest hallway of the school, we saw a figure. It was a tall man in a long dark coat. His face was hidden under a hat, and he was holding something that looked like a sack. "Mr. Edwards," Miss Graham called out. The figure froze, then slowly turned his head toward us. His face was hidden in shadow. Without answering, he stepped back and disappeared around the corner. "That's definitely not him," Lisa whispered, clutching my arm. We exchanged uneasy glances. Lisa suggested calling the police, but Miss Graham decided to investigate first, claiming it might just be a parent of one of the students. "Stay here," she said, and walked ahead. Lisa and I stayed behind, though I didn't feel comfortable about it. A few minutes later, we heard footsteps again, but this time they were coming from the other end of the hallway, as if someone was approaching us. Suddenly, the lights at the far end of the hallway flickered on, and we saw Mr. Edwards walking toward us. He looked puzzled. "What are you doing here?" he asked gruffly. "I thought everyone had gone home." We started explaining about the strange man in the coat, but the janitor cut us off sharply. "That's impossible. I just locked all the doors. No one could have gotten inside." Lisa tugged at my sleeve. "Can we just leave already?" she whispered. But then I remembered something odd. A few days ago, I overheard some younger students talking about the Christmas watchman, a strange figure in a coat who supposedly appeared in the school every December, scaring those who stayed late. I dismissed it as nonsense at the time, but now the story came rushing back. Mr. Edwards and I decided to check the upper floors and make sure all the doors were still locked. Lisa stayed in the main hall. On the third floor, the air was freezing, as if someone had opened a window, but all the windows were shut. On the floor, we found wet footprints, large ones, like those from men's boots. The trail led from the stairs to the storage room, where sports equipment was kept. When we opened the door to the storage room, it was empty. The air smelled strange, damp, like old fabric. "There's no one here," Mr. Edwards muttered, but I noticed his hands were trembling. At that moment, we heard a faint creak behind us. We turned around, but there was nothing there. "I'll check everything tomorrow," the janitor decided. "Let's get out of here." We went downstairs to get Lisa, but she wasn't in the main hall. My heart started racing. "Lisa!" I called out. No response. Suddenly, we saw her. Lisa was standing by the window of the assembly hall. The glow from the garlands inside lit up her face, and she looked strangely calm. "What are you doing there?" I asked as I entered the hall. She turned to me slowly. "He was here," she whispered, "but he's not bad." We exchanged confused glances with Mr. Edwards. "Who?" I asked. "The watchman," Lisa said. "The one who lost Christmas." Lisa explained that while we were gone, the man in the coat appeared again in the hall. He stood silently, staring at the Christmas tree. When she asked who he was, he replied, "I just want it to shine again." Then he vanished. I turned to look at the tree in the assembly hall. It was glowing brighter than before, as if someone had just added hundreds of new lights. "I think it's just one of the parents or kids," Mr. Edwards muttered, but his voice lacked confidence. That night, we finally left the school. But I couldn't stop thinking about the strange encounter. Who was that man? Why did he appear only at Christmas? The next day, I found out from old school records that many years ago, a watchman named Robert worked at the school. He died one winter while trying to extinguish a fire caused by faulty Christmas lights on the tree. Now, every year, when we decorate the school's Christmas tree, I remember that night and make sure to add the brightest lights, because maybe, just maybe, he's still watching, and in their glow, he finds his peace. I've always loved the mountains, their cold silence, vastness, and majestic views. When my friend Michael suggested spending Christmas at a mountain lodge in the Alps, I didn't hesitate. Our small group included Michael, his girlfriend Susan, my sister Hannah, and me. It was supposed to be an unforgettable holiday. The lodge was high in the mountains, surrounded by snow-covered forests. The nearest town was about 30 kilometers away. The journey there was difficult. Slippery switchbacks, dense fog, and a sudden snowstorm made us all uneasy. But when we arrived, we were greeted by a cozy cabin with a fireplace adorned with garlands and the scent of fresh pine branches. We settled into our rooms and spent the evening discussing our plans, skiing, forest walks, and a festive dinner. In the living room, I noticed an old bell on the table. Its metal had tarnished with age, and the wooden handle was carved with strange symbols. "What's this?" I asked the lodge owner when she came to wish us a good night. "It's just an old trinket," she replied with a smile. "They say it belonged to a hermit who lived here long ago, but it's just a legend." With that she left, and we all went to bed. The night was freezing, and I couldn't sleep. Through my light dozing, I heard a strange sound, a faint, barely perceptible ringing. It sounded like someone had gently struck the bell downstairs. I got up, left my room, and went down to the living room, but no one was there. The bell was in its place. I decided it was just my imagination, and went back to bed. The morning was uneventful. We laughed, played in the snow, and by evening, sat down for dinner. But when the clock struck midnight, everything changed. We were gathered by the fireplace when Susan suddenly said, "Someone's outside the window." I turned around. In the darkness, a figure flickered. At first I thought it was a reflection, but the figure moved too distinctly. Michael and I grabbed flashlights and went outside, but there was nothing, just snow and darkness. The forest stood silent and lifeless. "It's probably just a trick of the light," Michael said, but I could tell he was uneasy. When we returned, Hannah was sitting in a chair, staring at the bell. "Did you touch it?" I asked. "No," she replied without looking away, "but I think it rang." A creeping unease stirred inside me. We tried to forget about it and went to bed, but that night, things got worse. I woke to a whisper. It came from the hallway. I got up and saw Hannah. She was standing in front of the door leading to the basement, listening. "What are you doing?" I whispered. She turned to me. There was something strange in her eyes, almost alien. "Don't you hear it?" she whispered back. "Someone's down there." I walked closer and put a hand on her shoulder. Just then, a dull thud came from behind the door. We froze. A moment later, there was another, louder bang. I grabbed Hannah's hand and pulled her upstairs. I woke the others, and the three of us went down to the basement. It was dark and dusty, filled with rusty tools and old junk. There was nothing unusual. We were about to leave when Susan let out a gasp. In the corner was an old wooden box. Unlike the rest of the junk, it looked as though it had been placed there recently. We opened it and found several yellowed letters. On one of them was a drawing of the bell. "It's the same one," Susan whispered. Michael grabbed a letter and started reading. It was some kind of testament written by the hermit. He wrote that the bell connects worlds and that it must never be rung, or they will come. "This is nonsense," Michael said, but his hands were trembling. When we went back upstairs, we were met with a disturbing sight. The bell was gone. We searched the entire cabin, but it was nowhere to be found. The tension was unbearable. To distract ourselves, we lit candles and sat by the fire. But just as we began to relax, we heard it again. A faint ringing. This time, it came from the forest. We froze. "It's the wind," Michael said, though his voice quivered. Suddenly, Hannah stood up and headed for the door. "Where are you going?" I shouted. "They're calling," she whispered. "Can't you hear them?" I grabbed her arm, but she pulled away and ran into the darkness. We chased after her, shouting, but Hannah moved as though guided by an unseen force. Soon, we found ourselves deep in the forest. There she was, standing still, holding the bell in her hands. "Hannah," I shouted, "give it to me." But she only smiled. Her eyes glowed with a strange, icy light. Then she raised the bell and rang it. The sound was sharp and pure, piercing the still night. And then, from the darkness, figures began to emerge. They were tall, thin, with blank faces as if sculpted from shadows. With every step, their forms became more defined. We screamed, called out to Hannah, but she didn't seem to hear us. Michael tried to run to her, but one of the figures stretched out a hand and he froze as if paralyzed. "Run!" Susan screamed, grabbing my arm. We sprinted back to the cabin. When we reached the door, I turned back. Hannah was still standing there, and the figures were slowly closing in around her. That night, we heard no more ringing. Hannah never returned. In the morning, we left the lodge and reported her disappearance to the police, but they found nothing, just footprints in the snow leading into the woods, where they vanished. Since then, I've feared Christmas and the sound of a bell. The Forester's House. It all started as a simple trip to nature. My friend Alex convinced me to spend the weekend in a remote village to escape the hustle and bustle of the city. We decided to stay with his distant relatives who lived near the forest. Their house had once been a forester's hunting lodge, but was now just a cosy, albeit somewhat old-fashioned, countryside home. When we arrived, we were greeted by an elderly man named Peter, the owner of the house, and his wife, Maria. They seemed kind and welcoming, though I noticed a hint of unease in their eyes. The house was surrounded by dense woods, and the atmosphere here was entirely different. Silence, broken only by the rustling wind and occasional bird cries. Dinner passed peacefully. Alex and I laughed, listening to Peter's stories about his life in the forest. But as night fell, the mood shifted. While we were sitting by the fireplace, Maria suddenly asked, "Have you heard the old legend about those who live in the forest?" I smiled, thinking it was just another local ghost story. But Peter's expression grew serious. "It's not just a legend," he said. "This forest is strange. Unusual things have happened here." Intrigued, I asked for more details. Reluctantly, Peter began to explain. He said that long ago, a forester and his family had lived in these woods, but disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Locals believed the forest had swallowed them. At night, people occasionally claimed to hear strange sounds like voices or see flickering lights among the trees. "Just don't go into the forest at night," Maria added firmly. Of course, these stories only fueled our curiosity. Alex, like me, loved adventures, and we decided that an evening walk would be the perfect way to test the legends. An hour after dark, we set off with flashlights. At first, everything seemed normal, just trees, creaking branches, and the crunch of leaves underfoot. But the farther we went, the stronger the feeling grew that someone was watching us. "Maybe we should head back," I suggested uneasily. Alex waved me off. "Come on, it's just local folklore." But soon, we began hearing something strange. At first, it was a faint rustling, like someone creeping through the undergrowth. Then we heard quiet laughter. I froze. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Alex nodded, his confidence fading. We turned and shone our flashlights into the darkness, but saw nothing. All right, enough of this. Let's head back, Alex muttered. We turned to leave, but after a few minutes, I realized something was wrong. The path looked different. Trees we had passed earlier now appeared in places they shouldn't. This isn't the way, Alex stammered. Now I began to panic too. We tried to find familiar landmarks, but everything looked wrong. The darkness seemed thicker, as though the forest itself was unwilling to let us go. Suddenly we heard a child's voice. "Help me!" My heart clenched. The voice sounded faint, like a child calling out from deep within the forest. "That's impossible," Alex whispered. "There can't be anyone here." But the voice came again, closer this time. We exchanged uneasy glances, realizing it was dangerous to stay put, and decided to follow the sound. Soon we saw a light. It was a faint glow, like a lantern in the distance. We hurried toward it, hoping to find someone who could help us. But as we approached, the light disappeared. Instead, we found ourselves standing before an old, crumbling house. "Is this the forester's house?" Alex whispered. I didn't want to go inside, but something compelled us forward. The door creaked open as we stepped onto the porch, revealing a dark, eerie interior. The walls were marked with strange scratches, and the air felt thick, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind us. "Who's there?" Alex shouted, his flashlight sweeping the room. In the corner, we saw something that made our blood run cold. A figure stood there, a woman with hollow, empty eyes. She stared at us, motionless. "Leave!" she whispered in a low, rasping voice. I grabbed Alex's arm, and we bolted out of the house. The forest around us seemed alive. Branches groaned, whispers echoed, and shadows moved unnaturally. We ran blindly until we saw the lights of Peter's house in the distance. When we stumbled inside, Maria quickly locked the door and began praying under her breath. Peter looked at us with a mix of anger and concern. "I warned you not to go into the forest," he said gravely. We told them everything we had seen. Peter listened quietly before saying, "That was her, the forester's wife. She's still there, trapped in that cursed house. Her soul cannot find peace." We stayed awake the rest of the night, too shaken to sleep. At dawn, Peter walked us to our car and insisted we leave. "Never come back here," he said firmly. We did as he said. I've never returned to that village, but I often think about that night. Sometimes I dream of the forester's house and the woman with hollow eyes. But every time I wake up, I'm grateful that we made it out alive. The missing school diary. I never thought a random discovery in an abandoned classroom could change my life. That day, I stayed late after school to help the librarian, Miss West, sort through old books. We were cleaning out the storage room filled with forgotten textbooks, notes, and even diaries left behind by students over the years. Among the clutter, I found a thin notebook wrapped in a tattered leather cover. On the title page, it read, "The Diary of Lucas Barrow, 1976. I had never heard that name before. A strange feeling washed over me, like I had found something I wasn't supposed to. I opened the diary and started reading. Lucas was 15, just like me. His entries began as typical school notes, stories about friends, classes, and sports. But the further I read, the stranger the entries became. One page read, "I think someone's watching me. In classroom 206, I heard strange rustling sounds. But when I turned around, no one was there. The teachers say I'm imagining things, but I know something's not right." Classroom 206. I immediately remembered it was on the old floor of the school, which had been closed for years. When I mentioned this to Miss West, she gave me a strange look. "Don't go up there. That floor's been sealed off since the 80s. It's covered in dust and cobwebs," she said. But as soon as she turned away, I decided to check it out myself. That evening, I went up to the old floor when the school was nearly empty. The lights didn't work, so I brought a flashlight. The door to classroom 206 was locked, but the rusty lock looked weak. Using a ruler, I managed to pry it open. Inside, Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust. Old desks, a broken chalkboard, and books scattered on the floor. The silence was so heavy it made my ears ring. As I explored the room, something caught my eye. On one of the desks lay a sheet of paper. It definitely wasn't there when I walked in. On the paper were strange symbols drawn in ink. I didn't know what they meant, but I felt they were somehow connected to Lucas's diary. Back home, I opened the diary again. The entries were becoming more unsettling. I found a drawing on the desk. These symbols seem alive. They change when I look at them. Today, I heard a voice, someone whispering my name. I don't want to go back to that classroom, but something keeps pulling me there. The more I read, the more uneasy I felt. The last entry was brief. I don't think this is a school. It's something else. If you find this, leave. Don't make my mistake. The diary ended there. The next day, I told my friend Mike about the diary. He loved mysteries and was immediately hooked. Maybe it's just someone's made-up story, he suggested. Then how do you explain the paper with the symbols? I countered. We decided to go back to classroom 206 together. This time, we found even more strange things. Textbooks with scratched out names and one desk covered in claw marks, as if someone had been carving into it. When we got closer, I saw a single wall. Under one of the desks, we found an old trapdoor. After struggling to open it, we descended into the basement, the hidden room. The basement was cramped and dark. Pages with the same strange symbols were scattered across the floor. In one corner stood a broken chair, and next to it lay a faded backpack with a name tag, Lucas Barrow. As soon as I touched the backpack, a cold wind swept through the basement and the candles flickered. A glowing figure of a teenage boy appeared before us. "You found my diary," the figure said softly. "You need to finish what I couldn't." We stood frozen in fear, but the figure continued. "The symbols are a key. They'll open a door and let me move on." We gathered the scattered pages and pieced them together like a puzzle. When the final piece was in place, the symbols began to glow, and a warm light filled the room. Lucas stepped into the light, his form fading. "Thank you," he said before disappearing. After that night, all the strange occurrences stopped. The diary became an ordinary notebook, and the school was quiet once more. Mike and I donated the diary to the local history museum, ensuring Lucas's story would not be forgotten. That experience changed me forever. Sometimes, as I pass by the old classroom 206, I feel a faint warmth and smell the faint scent of candles. A gentle reminder that even in the darkest mysteries, there is a chance to bring light. The call from the other side. That evening seemed ordinary. Snow was quietly falling outside, the streets were nearly empty, and the string lights in my room cast a cozy glow over my small workspace. I was sorting through emails on my computer when my phone, lying nearby, suddenly vibrated. An unknown number appeared on the screen. It was already late, but I decided to answer. "Hello?" I said. A faint whisper came from the other end. "Edward, help me." I froze. The voice was soft, feminine, and painfully familiar. I knew this voice, but I couldn't place where from. "Who is this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. There was no answer, just rustling sounds and something that resembled wind. Then the call abruptly ended. I looked at my phone, but the number wasn't saved. I tried calling back, but the system informed me that the number didn't exist. That night was restless. I tossed and turned in bed, haunted by the voice from the phone. It wouldn't leave me alone. By morning, I remembered. The voice belonged to my Aunt Marion. Aunt Marion had been like a second mother to me. She cared for me whenever my parents were away for work, and she was the one who taught me to believe in miracles. But she had passed away 3 years ago. She died in a car accident on an icy road while driving to visit me. I tried to find a logical explanation for the call. Could someone be playing a cruel prank? Or had I imagined it? But deep down, I knew it was real. The next evening, I heard the phone ring again, the same number. This time, I answered quicker. "Edward, don't go there." the voice whispered. "Where? Marion, is that you?" I shouted. In response, I heard a strange noise like a heartbeat, and then the call cut off again. I didn't understand what was happening. These calls became a nightly occurrence. Sometimes I heard whispers, sometimes only static. Each time, Marion's voice sounded more desperate. A week after the first call, strange things started happening in my house. Pictures on the walls would shift as if someone had touched them. One morning, I found an old note from Marion on the kitchen table, a note I thought I had lost long ago. It read, "Listen to your heart." I realized I had to figure out what Marion was trying to tell me. Remembering her last words about "don't go there," I began to think of places connected to her life. On the third night after another call, I had a vivid dream. I saw the very intersection where the accident had occurred. In the snow, there was a clear message. There. Waking up in a cold sweat, I knew I had to go to the crash site. The following evening, I drove to the intersection where the accident happened. It was quiet and deserted. The snow-covered road signs stood eerily still. As I approached the site, my phone vibrated again. The same number was calling. "I'm here, Edward," the voice said. "Find me." "But where? What am I supposed to do?" I shouted into the phone. At that moment, I noticed something unusual. Near the edge of the road, among the bushes, was a small metallic object. I picked it up. It was a locket with Marion's picture inside, the same locket she always wore, but which was thought to have been lost in the crash. As soon as I touched the locket, the call ended. This time, though, I felt a strange warmth, as if someone was holding my hand. I brought the locket home. After that, the calls stopped, but I felt a deep sense of peace. I placed the locket next to Marion's photograph, and at that very moment, the string lights on my window lit up brightly, even though they hadn't worked before. I realized Marion had been trying to tell me she was still with me, watching over me. Since then, I no longer feel fear or sadness when I think of her. Instead, I know her love will always be a part of my life.